Our next question comes from Ronnie B. Hey, John and Rob. I've been reading reports that Apple may be buying Sony. How major of a shift would this be, and how much different do you think Sony's slate of movies will be with Apple as their owner? Thanks.
Well, okay. I don't know if you saw these stories going around, Robert. There were a bunch of stories going around that Sony was going to get bought by Apple, that Apple's going to buy Sony. And I had all these tweets from people asking me, hey, John, what do you think about these reports that, Apple's going to buy Sony? First thing we got to point out is this. There are no reports that Apple is buying Sony. It does not exist. Where all of this came from was this great little article that Variety wrote playing, future teller. What do you call those people? The fortune tellers. They're playing fortune teller. They wrote this article
the great
about
Criswell.
Yes.
Because the future is where the rest of us will spend the rest of our lives.
They did this article about here's some things that we are looking into the future of 2019 and things that will happen. And one of the things they wrote about their future gazing was Apple buying Sony. Here's what they wrote in their article, but this is all speculation for them. The article wrote, the Silicon Valley giant will finally recognize it could use some Hollywood expertise as it tries to catch up with Netflix and Amazon streaming services. Buying Sony gives Apple access to a library that includes Men in Black, Breaking Bad, Jumanji, as well as the rights to make more Spider-Man movies. That's a web Apple would be lucky to spin, or a web Apple would be lucky to spin. Also, buying a studio is basically a rounding error to a company worth $1 trillion. So let's be clear about this. This whole Apple interest in buying Sony thing and these reports, this all comes from just a speculation piece that Variety wrote. But that being said, and giving that disclaimer, this isn't a crazy idea because we all know that Apple has been trying to get into the content. They've been trying more and more. They've been making moves to get into the content business. Like Disney, who looked at Netflix and the Netflix model went, we got to get into this game, so they're starting Disney Plus. Apple is also seeing the same stuff, and they're like, you know what? We need to also be a media giant. Not just a technology giant. We can be a media giant because we've got the channels. We've got the platforms for distribution. We can do it all. We need to be a media giant. It is not an insane thought that they would want to then look into the possibility of purchasing a Sony. Sony, which has not been in great financial shape for the last couple of years, the one thing that works against it a little bit is that Sony, in the last couple of years, has seemed to be getting their house in order, and they are kind of waterproofing their boat a little bit. They're in a much better position now than they were. But while it was only speculation, it's not crazy because on its surface, it would look like a move that would make sense. Robert, you hear about stuff like this. Do you think this would be a wise move for either Sony or Apple?
Here's the thing. My first job after working on Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, I worked at Warner Brothers in feature production for a couple of years. And I saw the highest levels of the studio working. It's really hard to run a major studio and to know what movies to make. And a technology giant like Apple has been great. The iTunes platform has been tremendous. But to run a studio and to know how to manage talent and put movies together is a very different animal than it is to build the platforms on which to distribute this material. Amazon has been ramping up and has been doing a good job so far, doing decent shows like Man in the High Castle and doing The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and they are developing a pool of talent now, but it takes a while. Now, if Apple were to just jump in and buy Sony, would they retain the people? I mean, Fox, a lot of the great executives at Fox are being retained by Disney.
Yes.
Fox Searchlight, for instance, Nancy Utley is being brought over, and other executives are being brought over. But it could be a wise move, but then again, creating content is very different than distributing content. And while it might seem to be a shrewd move, as long as they have the people in place that can keep the boat moving forward, I'd say okay. But it's dicey. It's difficult. It's not something you can just, Apple's buying Sony. Great. We'll see.
You just raised a great point, which is why I do think it would be a smart move for Apple if it were to ever happen. Because, number one, you're not just acquiring properties. You're acquiring a company, which means you're bringing in that expertise along. Like if this was a story about Apple, we're going to buy the rights to Breaking Bad and we're going to buy the rights to Men in Black, that would be alarming. Because, well, you like you said, yeah, but you don't have the people who know how to do what they're doing. But if you're buying the company as a whole, and you bring in that talent that knows how to do that to now work in a synergistic kind of relationship with your platform people and your distribution, there's some pretty interesting things that could happen there. Now, a lot of people I've already been noticing, I've been hearing on Twitter and asking live in the chat board as well, is like, yeah, but if Apple buys Sony, then the Spider-Man rights revert back to Disney. That's not necessarily true.
No.
It's the same kind of scenario that we were looking at, that if Comcast had bought Fox, that the X-Men rights would have stayed with Fox. Here's the analogy, okay? Let's look at me and Robert here for a second. Let's say Robert owns a sports team. Let's say he owns the Seattle Seahawks. Robert is the owner of the Seattle Seahawks, right? Now,
they better play better than they did last weekend.
So let's say Ray Ora, who's sitting over there, is Robert's star quarterback. Ray has a contract with Robert to play for his Seattle Seahawks. It's a 5-year deal, whatever. So he's got a contract with him, right?
I paid him well, too.
And you paid him well. So now in this scenario, Robert is Sony, Ray is Spider-Man. Are you following me here? So Spider-Man has some legal obligation contracts with Sony. Sony's the owner. Now, here's the thing. If I come along, and let's say I'm Apple, all right? But let's say I'm another a sports owner, and I want to buy the Seattle Seahawks, all right? I can now buy the Seattle Seahawks, and now I am the owner of the Seattle Seahawks. Ray's contract does not disappear because Ray's contract is with the Seattle Seahawks. Regardless of who the owner of the Seattle Seahawks is, Ray has a contract with the corporation known as the Seattle Seahawks. And as long as the Seattle Seahawks are still intact, and as long as the Seattle Seahawks are still an existing corporation, then his contract stays valid. Had Comcast bought Fox and didn't break it apart for pieces but kept it together as its own company, the X-Men would have still stayed with Fox, even though Fox had new owners. If Apple were to come in and buy Sony outright and keep Sony together and keep it as a company, then whatever deals exist between Sony and other parties are still enforceable under law. So it would all depend. Like if Apple were to buy it and pick it apart for pieces, yeah, then Spider-Man rights go back to Marvel. If Apple buys Sony and keeps it all together as an existing corporation and company, then the deal's still valid and the deal's still good and Spider-Man stays exactly where he is.
Well, I was going to say the one thing that worries me and the one thing that I've seen for almost 30 years, the motion picture business, the movie business is the one business on the planet Earth that everybody thinks they know how to do. It doesn't matter who it is. Everybody thinks they know how to make movies. Look no further than Twitter to see how everybody would make a Star Wars film. It's not easy. And it's not, most of the people that run the studios are Ivy League educated business people. And you wonder, well, look, on paper, from a corporate standpoint, having an Ivy League educated business person is probably a good person to have in charge of hundreds of millions of dollars and how that money is being spent. But is that the best education to necessarily know what stories are great? You know, everybody else, they're looking, the great studio executives of yore, Louis B. Mayer and people like that, the buck stopped with them. They worked with their gut. You know, there was not the corporate interests that we have now, where people are beholden to boards of directors and shareholders who can bitch and moan and complain if your Justice League movie doesn't make $1 billion. So it worries me when you hear stories like Apple will take over, because I'm sure there's a whole group of people in Apple that'd be like, yeah, man, put me in charge. Even though, and I would be one of them, but I would bring a little something to it. But it worries me when these kinds of corporate mergers happen, because what happens is a lot of people lose their jobs, people are on the chopping block, and everybody wants their new employees to come in and take over. So there's good points and there's bad points.
There's potential for great things, there's potential for disaster as well. But still, it's an intriguing possibility, especially with that kind of an influx of money, when you got a company that's worth that much and what they could possibly experiment with and try. And Apple's never been a company that's been afraid to experiment.
No, that's true.
So, I mean, it could be good, could be bad. We'll have to wait and see.